Morning. Typically, I try to be fairly original with illustrations that I use. Not today. There's the Bear Valley lectures this past year. They were covering the second half of 1 Corinthians, which is where we're going to be today, is in 1 Corinthians. And there's a guy who went over the section that we'll be looking at today. His name is Daniel, and I have a lot of respect for him. And he used an illustration before getting into this text that I thought was really good. And I tried to come up with a different one or think of another comparison to be drawing, and I couldn't come up with a better one. So this is not the original one. Sorry. Imagine, though, that you're a Christian, but if you're going to be really honest with yourself, and this might actually be true for some of us. I'm not saying I think this of anybody, but we should always be looking at ourselves. Maybe you are not putting God at the center of your life. You know, if someone were to ask you, are you a Christian? Is God the most important thing in your life? You're going to say yes. But if you're going to be really honest with yourself, your job might be more important. Your family might be more important. And is your job important? Yes. Is your family important? Yes. We should not neglect important areas of our life. But that doesn't mean that they should become more important than God. So, you do what you're supposed to do. You've been baptized. You go to church every Sunday. You spend time with your Christian friends, and you study your Bible. But really, God just isn't the most important part of your life. You're just kind of going through the motions. One day you come home, and you open your door, and there's a pair of shoes on the floor that you know don't belong to you, which means someone's probably in your house. You know they're not your shoes. You know these shoes don't belong to anyone else in the house, but they look kind of familiar. And you don't even walk in the house yet or ask, hey, who's there? But you pick it up and you start examining it. It's an older, it's a leather shoe. You can tell it at one point had kind of a deep brown color to it. But as you look at it, it's very worn. The toes are certainly very worn, and you flip it over and the sole has seen some use. And then on the inside, there's a deep imprint where a foot regularly sits. And you still can't figure out who this belongs to until you lift up the tongue and you see a name and your heart stops. It's the name of your grandfather. And now you realize, I have seen these shoes before. He wore these to church every Sunday, and he was buried in them. Why are they in my house? And then suddenly from the kitchen, you hear a deep, gravelly voice call out your name. And you walk in there, and there's your grandfather sitting at your table. You sit down and you talk to him, and you're scared, of course, but you're also excited because you love this man, and you're happy to be seeing him again. He tells you, the things that I believed before I died, I believed in Jesus, I was a Christian. It's all true. But it's so much better than I ever thought it would be. After that conversation takes place, and of course I don't think that's something that could actually happen to us, but imagine it did. Do you think that God might be a little bit more important to you after something like that? Why? Is it because you learned something new from the Bible? No, your knowledge really hasn't increased at all as far as what God expects from us, but your level of conviction is different. I am fully convinced that the way we live our lives is indicative of how convicted we are that Jesus is who he says he is. If I am extremely weak in my faith and I'm really not placing a lot of importance in being pleasing to God, probably it's because I'm not fully convicted in here that the Christ was sacrificed and that he was raised from the dead. Taylor did a great job reading to us this section from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul is talking about the resurrection. There's a problem, there's a lot of problems with the church here in Corinth. They have some who are claiming that maybe the resurrection didn't take place. There are some things that we need to accept that would be true if that were the case, and Paul even talks about this. If there's no resurrection of the Christ, then how can there be a resurrection of the dead? If there's no resurrection of Christ, we are, of all men, most to be pitied. You see, everything is worthless if the Christ wasn't resurrected. So if he has been raised from the dead, then that means it demands something from us. And if we read through this, we're not going to read through all of it, but if we read through this chapter, and Paul says all these things, and it makes a lot of sense, it's not really difficult to understand a lot of what he says, and it's really hitting hard. And then all of a sudden you come to verse 29. Some of you may have read this before and thought, well, that's weird. So he talks about the resurrection, and verse 29, otherwise, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised, why then are they baptized for them? What does that mean? There's a practice that is held by some religious groups. I think Mormons actually practice this. It's called vicarious baptism. Basically, the idea of vicarious baptism is that someone has died, separated from Christ, and I can myself be baptized on their behalf so that they can be saved. Is that what Paul's talking about? It kind of sounds like it, doesn't it? Let's read it again, understanding that vicarious baptism is a practice with some people. Otherwise, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why then are they baptized for them? That's what it sounds like. There have been a lot of different ideas that have come up regarding this text. I was looking at a few different commentators to see what they had to say about it. I obviously have my own opinion, but a couple different guys said that over the centuries, there have been over 200 different theories formed around what they think Paul's probably saying here. And I looked at a few of these theories, and I think most of them are easy to debunk within seconds, with only kind of paying attention to the context or even just a simple word structure. I'm not going to name all of them, but I'm just going to go ahead and name a few. Maybe we can rule out some of these in our own minds. Some I think that baptism for the dead, like the dead would be referring to Christ. So like, for Christ, I'm being baptized. That doesn't really make sense. First of all, the dead there, it's plural. Because notice in the second part of verse 29, he says, why then are they baptized for them, not for him? Them is a plural. So clearly it's not referring to the Christ, it's referring to them, someone else, or other groups of people that are dead. Also, that word for, it's not because of, well, it is because of. It's not like in response to. So like, they died, so I realized that I'm mortal, therefore I need to be baptized. The word there in the Greek for it, it's huper, it's on behalf of, not necessarily because of, like in a response. So it's literally for the benefit of the dead, is what that word is saying. There's a lot of other ways we could look at this. And if you want to talk to me afterwards, then I can go ahead and lay this out, but I'm trying to not keep us too long, even though no one cares about the Pro Bowl. But if I look at this, I really can't get away from what it sounds like. It sounds like he's talking about vicarious baptism, and if I'm going to be honest, I think that's what he's talking about. So before I get stoned, let me explain myself. I don't, stoned like punished. I do not believe this to be a legitimate practice. I don't want to be misunderstood there. But I do believe this is what he's referring to. But if I'm going to make a claim, I need to substantiate that. I can't just assert my opinion and let that sit. Right? I don't think that's okay for me to do unless I'm making it clear that I don't actually know if that's the truth. I do not believe it to be a legitimate practice because it is completely inconsistent with God's plan for salvation. There is nothing else in any other part of the Bible that lends any evidence to supporting this as a legitimate practice. In fact, it does the opposite. Just to draw a few examples, in Luke chapter 16, we have a story of the rich man and Lazarus that Jesus is telling. If you're unfamiliar with the story, there's two guys. There's a rich man who is apparently evil, and there's a poor man named Lazarus who is apparently righteous. Both of these men die, and they go to this realm. We call it Hades, typically. It's not heaven, and it's not hell. It seems like it's a place of waiting. And on one side, where the rich man is, he's in a place of torment. He's uncomfortable. I don't know exactly what it is. He describes being in fire. And then there's a chasm that's really big. And then on the other side of that chasm, there's a place of rest, a place of paradise, and that's where Lazarus was. And it says he was in Abraham's bosom. So that's where Abraham, the guy from the Old Testament, also was. And there's this dialogue between the rich man and Abraham. And Abraham points out that no one can cross over from the side of torment to the side of paradise, and no one can cross over from the side of paradise to the side of torment. So no one can cross over. Well, if they can't cross over, then what good is it going to do if someone is baptized on behalf of that rich man? He can't cross over. So it seems, at least within that story, that doesn't make any sense. And if that chasm isn't fixed, that no one can cross over, then why is Jesus telling the story? Whether you believe it to be a parable or an actual historical event, that's a question that I think is worthy of being asked if we're saying vicarious baptism is legitimate. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, you have death, and then after that you have judgment. So even if judgment has not been pronounced, in other words, like a sentence to be carried out, our destination is sealed at the point that we die. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, and also Romans 14:12 makes mention that people will give an account of themselves to God. So if I'm giving an account of myself to God, why does it matter what someone else is doing for me? I mentioned that one of the religious groups that practices this is the Mormons, which is interesting. I don't know a whole lot about the Book of Mormon, but there is an excerpt that I found from Alma 35 that is actually a point against vicarious baptism. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but in the final part of that section says this is the final state of the wicked. When I use the word final in any conversation, I mean that's it. That's the end. Nothing is going to change. It's the final. If something comes after that, well, then this is not final, right? But if this is the final state of the wicked, their punishment is the final state of them, then what can I do for them? Nothing else can be changed. So I say that this is not a legitimate practice. And yet here it is. It's in the Bible. Or it really seems like it's in the Bible. If we're going to look at something that is very difficult for us to understand, what is the first thing we need to look at? The context. The context will give you the answer. If it's doctrinally significant, I am convinced that the context will always give us the answer we're looking for. If it's impossible for us to find the answer, then my opinion is that it is not doctrinally significant. We don't need to have all the answers that we might have questions to. Or, if this is what Paul is talking about, then what's the point? I mean, even looking at this in its context, where these people are denying that the resurrection took place, well, how does this, what he's saying, can fit within the context? One thing I need to make clear, I meant to mention this earlier. Just because Paul mentions something does not immediately validate that practice. Earlier on in this letter, he talks about idolatry. Are any of us going to assert that Paul is saying idol worship is legitimate? No. He's talking about it because it's something they're familiar with. He's pointing out something about it. There's a reason he's bringing it up, and it's not to say that it's a legitimate practice, right? I believe that's the same thing that's going on here. There was a practice at this time where people were being baptized on behalf of the dead. So then Paul, talking about the resurrection, remember he was saying, if there is no resurrection, then we cannot be raised from the dead. If there is no resurrection, we are to be pitied. If there is no resurrection, then why be baptized for someone else? Even if that was a legitimate practice, why are you doing that if Christ wasn't raised from the dead? He's pointing out their own inconsistencies with themselves is all he's doing. He's not legitimizing what they're doing. He's pointing out the inconsistency. Even within their own false doctrine, they're inconsistent. Something else I would like to point out. Notice the pronouns here. Whenever Paul is talking about himself, he will use words like I or me. When he's talking to the people that this letter is addressed to, the Christians in Corinth, the church, he will use the word you. Whenever he's talking about those who are exercising this practice, does he use I, me, you, we, us, our, any first or second person words? No, he uses the third person, them, as someone else. He's not talking about the Christians in Corinth. Maybe people who consider themselves to be Christians. But this is not talking about a practice of the church. It's a practice that the church is familiar with. But I don't think that this text is lending support to say that the church is practicing this and that Paul is validating it. Okay, so that being said, I hope I made myself clear. Let's continue on reading with that vein of thought then. He's pointing out again, if Christ wasn't raised from the dead, then why X? Verse 30, why are we also in danger every hour? I affirm, brethren, by the boasting in you, which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord, I die daily. If from human motives I fought with wild beasts at Ephesus, what does it profit me? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. If Christ wasn't raised from the dead, the only logical conclusion that we can arrive at as far as how we should be living our lives is hedonism. That's what we must arrive at. If you're unfamiliar with hedonism, in a nutshell, basically, it's if it feels good, do it, is what that says. I don't remember how long ago. I remember Clayton talking about hedonism some time back, and that's basically what that is. If it feels good, do it. And that makes sense. If Christ is not Lord and King, if he has not been raised from the dead, if you and I are damned eternally, then why do I need to practice any religion at all? Why don't I just go off of my natural urges and I'll just live life however I want to? That would be consistent. But here we have people who say there is no resurrection, and yet they still have religious practices. Are we seeing that he's still pointing out their inconsistencies with each other? That's what this is all about. If there is no resurrection, there is no point in any of this. But, was there a resurrection? I think so. I think there's a lot of evidence to point that. In fact, I'm very convinced it is not only because the Bible says it, but because people who have more resources and are more intelligent than I am have tried to say that the resurrection didn't take place, and no one can prove that. There's a guy, I'm sure many of us are familiar with his name, is this guy, his name is Lee Strobel. He was a journalist, I believe for the Chicago Tribune. There's a big paper in Chicago. Some of you may have read his book called The Case for Christ. I think it was also made into a movie. Basically, he was an atheist. And his wife was an atheist, but something had happened and she had come to have a belief in Jesus. And Lee was upset about this. So he wanted to destroy her faith and bring her back to the world of atheism with him. From his own logic, because he's a very intelligent guy, and from some advice he got from a mentor that he realized that if he wanted to destroy the Bible, he didn't have to attack every part of it. All he had to do was prove the resurrection wasn't true. And I agree with him. If the resurrection didn't take place, then the rest of the Bible falls apart. The plan of salvation falls apart. It's not that the resurrection saved us. It's the sacrifice of Christ that saved us, right? But if there's no resurrection, there's no proof that the death worked. Okay? So Lee, being the great journalist and investigator that he is, tried to prove that the resurrection didn't happen. He talked to a lot of different experts in various fields. Biblically, you can't say that it didn't happen. Medically, you can't prove that it didn't happen. Historically, you can't prove that it didn't happen. Psychologically, you can't prove that it didn't happen. Every way that someone would try to attack a historic claim falls flat on its face. It's not only like, oh yeah, we're not really sure. All the evidence points towards it did happen. So strong was the evidence that a strong enemy to the Bible like Lee Strobel ended up believing in Christ. And he and I have some very different theological views, but that's how strong the resurrection is. It proves that everything did happen. So if I believe it happened, if he believed it happened, well, what does that do? It changes your life. He changed his life completely and is living a very different lifestyle than what he was before that moment. Why? Because now he's convicted. Same thing, if you heard your grandfather tell you about what he saw afterwards, you would be convicted and you would probably change a couple things about yourself. This is how our response should be. If I truly am convinced that the resurrection took place, then my actions will reflect that belief. There's a way that we were taught at Bear Valley to structure our sermons. And that is that the introduction should be no more than 15% of the time consumed in the lesson. That was the introduction. I'm not going to follow this formula. In talking about this and arriving at that conclusion, where Paul says, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, immediately after that he gives 3 imperatives. 3 things that he's expecting people to do. Why? Because the Christ was resurrected. His resurrection demands something from you and from me. And the people in this church, the letter to whom this was addressed, they had some problems. And on the heels of talking about how significant the resurrection is and what it means, Paul gives these directions for them. The first one, verse 33, a verse that I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. I think it was last week. Riley had ordered some pillowcases for us. And one thing about, I don't know if everyone does this, typically whenever we get new clothes or sheets or something like that, we wash them before we use them. Just 'cause I don't know who handled it at the store, and I want all my stuff to smell the same before I wear it. So we had these new sheets and these pillowcases, and before using them, we were going to wash them. And we also have two sets of bed sheets that we use. One set is gray, the other set is white. And we just, while one is washed and the other one gets put on the bed. Dave knows where this is going. I don't have white sheets anymore. because it was time to wash the sheets, the white sheets, and I was like, oh, we have these new red pillowcases that I decided to put in the load. So now we have gray sheets and we have pink sheets. Why did this happen? Because of the environment surrounding these sheets, now something else is affecting them. It's the same thing with you and me. I learned something, but a lot of you probably already knew you shouldn't do that. But this is exactly how you and I are. This might be common sense to some of you here, but whether we understand this principle or not, it's time now to understand it. Bad company corrupts good morals. The things that we put around us, the environment that we find ourselves in, will shape the way that we view the world, it will shape the way we respond to hard situations, and it will shape the way that we treat people. And it'll shape the way that we respect God. 100% of the time. If I surround myself with friends who are bad influences, and whatever that might be, I'm not being specific here because this is a broad application, they will pull me down and pull me away from Christ. They will distract me from my conviction of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I will not live a life pleasing to God. This Greek word company, some would say, could also be translated as message. In other words, a bad message corrupts good morals. So I would say that not only is this talking about friendship, it's talking about whatever content we fill our minds with. So could it be friends or family members that are bringing my morality down? It could be. Could it be the TV shows that I'm watching? Could it be the music that I listen to? Could it be the video games that I play? Could it be the articles that I read, the political podcasts I listen to, whatever it is? I'm not saying all these things are inherently bad, but we need to understand that what we fill our minds with will shape the way that we act. Not that it removes any excuse from us, of course. But if I listen to music that has a lot of language, and I watch music that has, watch movies and TV shows that have a lot of language and stuff in it, and then someone cuts me off on the road, what is going to be my initial reaction? But to use some of those words that I've been filling my mind with. Why? Because it's there. It's just sitting there waiting to be used. We're sponges, and eventually the sponge is going to get wrong, and everything is going to come out. We need to understand that what we surround ourselves with is going to affect the way that we view the world and the way that we act. But if bad company corrupts good morals, then the opposite must also be true. That it's that good company promotes good morals. If we are going to get rid of some of the negative influences in our life, it's important that we are just as adamant, just as we pay just as much attention to the importance of then filling that empty area with that which is good. There's a guy that I know who came back from church camp one week, and if you've been to a good church camp before, you know what I'm talking about when I mention a spiritual high. You're just so on fire and just ready to just go out and serve God. And it's good, it's just hard to keep that fire going. But he came back, and that same day he took all of his movies and entertainment stuff that he had and took it out to the backyard and just destroyed it all with a hammer and threw it away. Which is good, because he shouldn't have been paying attention to that stuff anyways. But I know him pretty well. He then failed to fill his life with good things. So that was several years ago that happened, and now he's back to watching the same kind of garbage, paying attention to the same kind of stuff that he just shouldn't be. Why? Because he didn't take the time to fill that with wholesome entertainment. He didn't take time to bring in more friends that are going to encourage him to pay more attention to that which is good and ignore that which is bad. So it shaped his worldview. We need to pay attention to what we surround our lives with. We need to we need to have things around us that will encourage us to pay attention to Jesus, the resurrection, that which convicts me so that I will live a life pleasing to God. I do not think that Paul is advocating that we completely remove ourselves from the world, which is a reaction that some might have. I do think that's the easier way to go in many cases, but we cannot effectively evangelize to the world if we are 100% removed from the world. That doesn't really make any sense. And even earlier on in the same letter in chapter 5, he makes the point that he is not expecting Christians to completely remove themselves from non-Christians, right? So there needs to be some balance that's struck, but generally as a rule, I should be surrounding myself with things that will encourage me to live a life pleasing to God. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. Verse 34, he gives a second imperative. He says, become sober-minded as you ought. Notice he's not saying be sober. He says become sober-minded, implying that they are not currently sober-minded. This word could be used to describe someone who is becoming not drunk anymore from alcohol. the context doesn't fit that that's what he's saying, unless he knew that they were going to have a pretty good buzz going whenever they received this letter. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. This word, the way that BDAG kind of phrases it, is come to your senses. Wake up. You are clearly not focused the way you ought to be, church. You are not focused on the resurrection and what this demands of you. When we think about some of the things that Paul talks about earlier on in this letter, some of the specific sins that he identifies that are a problem for many of the members of this church, either they're guilty of them, or they're encouraging others to do so, or they're just simply turning a blind eye. Well, why is all this stuff going on in this church? Because they're out of their minds. They're not focused on the resurrection like that to be. They're not convicted in here, and they're not focusing on the truth, on the gospel of Jesus Christ. Therefore, everything else is coming in. So he's reminding them, you got to wake up, guys. This is the real world that we're living in. Clear your mind, come to your senses, realize how terrible you're acting, and stop mistreating one another. Stop, doing some of the disgusting things that were mentioned earlier on in this letter. Stop it. Become sober-minded. Keep your focus where it needs to be. And then the third imperative, and stop sinning. This one, oddly enough maybe to you, sticks out to me more so than the other two. Not because it's hard to understand, but he doesn't say kind of taper off on the sinning or slow down a little bit or give yourself some time but eventually put it away. Stop sinning. Stop. Why? Because if I continue to live a willfully sinful life, I clearly do not believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I cannot say that I am a Christian and continue living in sin at the same time. They cannot be together. Now, do I struggle at times? Do I sometimes fall short and commit a sin? Absolutely, we all do, right? Paul himself in Romans chapter 7 makes it clear that he also has the same struggle in the flesh. But nowhere in the New Testament are Christians identified as sinners. They are formerly sinners. When it talks about a sinner in the Bible, it's talking about someone who lives a lifestyle of sin without repentance. That cannot apply to Christians. If you are a sinner, you are not a Christian. And you might disagree with me on that statement, but I get that from the Bible. They cannot be put together. So this is why Paul's saying, stop sinning. There's a man listed earlier on in this book who's having relations with his stepmother. Paul is talking about this guy. He's talking about other people who have all these other sins that he's identifying. What I want us to notice is that with some of these specific sins that Paul is identifying as being present in the church there, some of them would be very difficult for people to stop. They might be addicting, or they might have a strong emotional attachment to these sins. Whatever they may be, the expectation is still the same. Stop it right now. We can do it. But what is it that will motivate me to stop immediately and turn my life over to God? By having the proper conviction. If I am convinced that the Christ was resurrected, then I will have my life in perspective, and it'll be a lot easier for me, not easy, but easier for me to put that sinful lifestyle away and turn and serve God and God alone, rather than serving myself. There's a guy who he's dead now. I don't think you'd mind me using his name if he was still alive, but I'm not going to. But he was a preacher, and he was older. And he grew up in a time where smoking just wasn't a big problem. You know, there's a point in this time where smoking was even encouraged by doctors, oddly enough. So that's the area that he grew up in. But then some things were learned. People realized, we should really not smoke anymore. But he had the habit. And one day his nephew was talking to him, and he said, Uncle, I'm going to say his name, as long as you continue to smoke, you will not be effective as you could be as a preacher, as an evangelist, which is, I would argue, true. Immediately, he stopped being a smoker. He didn't taper off. He was convicted, wow, I'm not serving God to my greatest capacity, whatever it is, because I have this addiction. So he put it away. He kept that pact for the rest of his life as a reminder to put away my selfish ways so that I can be more effective as a servant of God. And that is the disposition each one of us needs to take. Whatever things we might be addicted to, whatever sin issues we might have, we need to be ready to put them away. Why? Because Christ was raised from the dead. If I really believe that, then I can stop sinning like he has called me to. If I have a clear mind. then I will stop sinning like he called me to. If I have a clear mind, I will not allow myself to be so influenced by negative things around me and lose my focus. I will not be deceived by the world. Continuing reading in verse 32, verse 34, after he gives that third imperative, he says, "For some have no knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame." Let's go ahead and pause on everything else for just a moment. Some have no knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame. What is implied here? Other than that Christians are expected to tell other people about God. It's a shame that the people around these Christians do not know who God is. Not that they're not Christians, that they don't even know God. They have no knowledge of God. He has made his plan so that you and I are the ones that carry out his message. So I speak this to your shame. There's a lot more that could be said about this, but I want to draw a comparison here. Earlier on, just a few verses ago, he was talking about people who are being baptized for the dead. Now he's talking about you should be evangelizing. You should put these things away, focus on the resurrection, and evangelize. Tell other people about the benefit that they can receive. If baptism for the dead is a legitimate practice, why is evangelism so important? I can just wait for them to die and then I'll be baptized for them. Right? I mean, if we're going to be consistent. But if evangelism is as important as the Bible makes it out to be, including in this text, then clearly vicarious baptism is not necessary. Our conviction that Jesus was raised from the dead is absolutely necessary for you and for me to put away our sinful ways and to become or remain children of God. If I really am convinced that he was raised from the dead, not only am I going to make the decision to obey him, I will tell other people that the Christ was raised from the dead, that salvation has been offered for them too. If I am not doing these things, then maybe I just am not convinced. Maybe I'm not convicted in my heart that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. It's important that we keep this in perspective, that we constantly try to remind ourselves of how big of a deal this really is, that we can have a relationship with God, and that the proof is in the resurrection. So we have the proper focus that we need to have in this life so that we can be pleasing to him. In just a moment, Ryan is going to come up here and lead a song, and at that moment, an invitation will be offered. This invitation is extended to anybody who has been struggling. Maybe you are not or have not been convicted in your heart that the resurrection took place and that something is demanded of each of us, and you have been struggling in your faith, or maybe you have slipped into a sinful lifestyle that you need help getting out of. I'm not saying it's easy for us to get rid of our sin, but it's still important. And God has instituted this church so that we can be a support to one another, to help guide each other, so that we can live a life that is pleasing to him, so that whenever that day comes that we either leave this earth or Jesus returns, we will stand on the side that has been justified, been cleansed by Jesus' blood, and will not be condemned by our own evil doings. Or maybe you have another issue that you just need some prayers of encouragement for. Not even necessarily a sin issue, but you need help and you want to make that known for the church. Or maybe there's someone who hasn't yet made the decision to acknowledge the reality of their need to be cleansed by Jesus' blood by being baptized, but you'd like to do so. Whatever your need is, I ask that you will come forward while we stand and sing this invitation song.